La profesora Caterina Carta, ella es italiana, de Sicilia, y ha desarrollado su carrera como investigadora y como académica, profesora, pues más que en Italia, yo creo que en el resto del mundo, ¿no? Ella es actualmente profesora, investigadora y responsable también de un programa de posgrado en el Vesalius College, que está adscrito a la Universidad Libre de Bruselas, en la que también participa en el Centro de Estudios de Gobernanza, de Diplomacia y Seguridad. Y anteriormente pues, ha tenido relación institucional, ha trabajado en diferentes universidades. En particular, pues, hemos estado mirando el currículum, ¿no? Pues en la Universidad de Siena, en la London School of Economics, en la Universidad de Kent, el campus que tiene en Bruselas, y también en la Universidad de Laval, donde ha estado también recientemente un par de años, ¿no? Trabajando. Y bueno, y ahora está desarrollando también raíces un poco en España, ¿eh? Así que esperamos contar con ella también en el futuro en otros proyectos, que nos ha comentado que tiene intención de estar más tiempo por España también. Ella es una especialista de las pioneras en, digamos, en centrarse en el estudio del Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior desde una perspectiva muy innovadora. Debo decir que el primer libro que se publicó en inglés sobre el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior, lo publicó Caterina Carta. No en castellano, porque el profesor Aldecoa publicó uno justo el año anterior, cuando todavía no se había creado, y yo creo que fueron los dos primeros libros que se publicaron en Europa sobre esta cuestión. Después se ha publicado mucho, pero ella tiene un enfoque siempre muy innovador, donde combina pues, una atención, por un lado, a lo que sería la dimensión institucional del Servicio de Acción Exterior, la dimensión institucional también en el sentido de la cultura organizacional, de las pautas de organización del trabajo, de la burocracia, del ciclo de la formulación y de la implementación de las políticas, pero también innovadora también porque pues, ha desarrollado un trabajo etnográfico con entrevistas a fondo con profesionales, ¿no? Del Servicio de Operación Exterior y de los servicios diplomáticos de los Estados miembros, y también pues, con innovación en el estudio del análisis del discurso y otras muchas enfoques, digamos, bien interesantes. Y en los últimos, yo diría, 2 años, pues está centrado un poco más en lo que sería el estudio de la dimensión cultural, de la proyección de la Unión Europea en el mundo y de la diplomacia cultural, o de la dimensión de la importancia de la cultura, digamos, en la proyección internacional de la Unión Europea. Caterina va a intentar al menos acompañar, ¿no?, la sesión suya, pues hablando también en castellano en algún momento, para facilitar que os animéis a hacer las preguntas, pero me dice que en algún momento va a tener que pasar al inglés porque se siente un poquito insegura todavía con el castellano. Bueno, cuando quieras, Caterina.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por la amable presentación, Noé. Muchas gracias una vez más al profesor Aldecoa y a la profesora Rodríguez para la invitación. Es un placer verdadero estar aquí a San Lorenzo del Escorial con vosotros. Pues tengo que decir que me hace un poco difícil hablar de servicio después un ponente del calibre de Fulvio Atina. Pero could be that speaking in English will make this task just a little bit easier. So I will try as much as possible to include some Spanish, some Castilian in my presentation, but I will do the bulk of it in English. Pero por favor, no dude a plantear preguntas en español y yo voy a intentar de responder en español o en español. Muy bien. Francisco Aldecoa me ha pedido de hablar hoy de servicio de acción exterior. And so what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is trying to give you a general idea of the process of reform that characterized the EU's machinery to deal with external policies. I will do so, but specifically focusing on executive actors and therefore the EAS even more specifically. I will first sort of try to give you an idea on how the process of external policy making works at the European level, and I will do so by drawing on a simplified model of policy cycle. It's not surprising, my argument will be that actually the Lisbon Treaty complicated and increased compartmentalization in the making of external policies. I will then zoom in the specific of the establishment of the European External Action Service. There, my argument, even less surprisingly, will be that actually the making of the service increased a turf battle at the European level. And this sort of shortcoming by design, as I call them, clearly stemmed by disagreement among national and institutional actors on the missions and role of the service. Perfect. So today you already had a great lecture on the challenges and opportunities that the EU has in reforming and drawing on multilateralism. Yesterday you had a very good meta rodunda on the geopolitical implications, how geopolitics and the changing geopolitical environment impact over the ambitions of the EU. With me, we will do a step back. And we will zoom in the specific characteristics and conditions that allow the European Union to sort of perform any sort of action at the international level. After all, if we think about it, the mantra of the capability expectations gap draws precisely on the idea that the EU needs to match its international ambitions with some form of clear commitment that at times is not quite there, and also clear and sound institutional structures. So yesterday Mariola was pointing at this. When we talk about foreign policy, we clearly use a single number for it, but still we need to take into account that the making of foreign policy at the European levels sort of draws on two prevalent methods of policy making. So on the one hand, since the Treaty of Rome, I'm not going clearly to revise the history of integrations in foreign policy matters since the outset. I will simply very quickly glance into it. But on the one hand, when we look at so-called external policies, like common commercial policy being an example of this, we see that since the Treaty of Rome, the letter of the treaty imagine a very strong role for supranational institutions. When we look at foreign policy narrowly defined, clearly the history of European integration shows the presence of strong taboos. Ever since the failure of the European defense community, we know that some sort of taboos, meaning supranationalism and defense cooperations, for instance, have been a leitmotif of the development in this policy field. And there, clearly, we have seen that it is an interesting process, the one that brought about the introduction, first of all, the first formal mention in the Single European Act, and then the introduction of a common foreign security policy with the establishment of a pillar structure. Please do raise questions. I'm talking to students here. If I am saying something that doesn't make sense, just to make sure that we are on the same page. But yes, the pillar structure confirmed the presence of a separate method of policy making when it comes to foreign policy, whereby, as we will see more into detail in a second, clearly we have a far more strong imprinting of intergovernmental cooperation when it comes to foreign policy. And there, as you well know, ever since Maastricht, with the progressive reforms that were engendered by the Amsterdam Treaty and the following modifications, for instance, with the inclusions of some sort of cooperation in the matter of defense, with the creation of the post of the High Representative, Solana as Spaniards for a long time, explain and see the long trend of foreign policy making in the European Union. Well, we know that nominally the Lisbon Treaty abolished the pillar structure. And yet, when it comes to foreign policy, these taboos that I mentioned before are hard to die. And so we will see, and we shall see, how actually intergovernmentalism still is a feature of foreign policy making at the European level. So if we are looking for a definition of what European Union's foreign policy is, I like very much the definition that Kökeler and de Roo have proposed. It's single by name in the sense that the word common, although it may be conceived as a misnomer, explain and reflect the ambitions to play a strong single role at the international level. It is dual by regime in the sense that, as we will see, there are two peculiar and different methods of policy making in place, depending on the nature of competencies, and multiple by name. Because, as we shall see, any and each policies that have an international reflex sort of respond to different policy-making structures and decision-making processes. Now, this picture gives you a snapshot in what it means that there are two different methods of policy-making. On the one hand, for external policies or external actions, as we now call them, the Commission holds the power of initiative. So policies such as trade, such as development, but also policies that have an important international spin-off. And nowadays, with the changing nature of challenges at the international level, we can imagine that virtually all policies have a strong international spin-off and require the Union, impose and back the Union to be able to act at the international level. So the Commission has the power of initiative. Then we have got bicameral, quasi-federal procedures of decision-making involving the Parliament and the Council. And then we have the Court of Justice exercising its power of control of the policy being made. On the contrary, when we move to the so-called intergovernmental field of cooperation, being this foreign policy, we see that there is far less interference on behalf of supranational institutions, a sort of constant strive for practices of consensus among the member states when it comes to controversial decision, and a case-by-case concerted methods of policy making rather than a legal framework for decisions. So we still call them decisions, but actually the word decision doesn't reflect a legislative process that is analogous to what happens to the community methods there. As you can see from this illustration, the newly established High Representative Vice President of the Commission and a newly established EEAS, European External Action Service, are sort of located in the institutional grey areas that attempts to bridge the two different methods of policy makers. We will discuss this, but clearly the introduction, the maintenance, informal but real maintenance of the pillar structure when it comes to foreign policy. So it is abolished, but it's sort of still there. And the additions of new institutional players did complicate the script of having policy being done at the European level at all the stage of decision making. So, I already mentioned that Lisbon maintained unaltered the divisions between foreign and external foreign policy field. But what Lisbon did, it's to create a massive rearrangement of all executive actors dealing with foreign policy. So we have a renewed and strengthened European Council, now, as you all know, with a new permanent president of the European Council in charge of these positions from 2.5 years. Yeah? Many of you perhaps are studying institutions or are studying, I don't know, the financial or migration policy field. You may see and you may have bumped in theoretical arguments that have to do with a new form of intergovernmentalism, meaning that in order to widen the spectrum of cooperation, we do not create new policy areas or expand competencies for existing institutions, but sort of delegate at the highest level, the ability of informally discussing of policy. So we have right now, and in the light of more than 10 years of continuous crisis stretching the ability of the European Union to act, a reinforced European Council. In parallel, Lisbon engendered a massive reorganization of the Council of the European Union. We will discuss that and we will see what it means in practice. For the moment, just let me mention that Lisbon has created, in addition of the existing General Affairs Council that draws on its own a system of hierarchy, the COREPER and what we call horizontal working group, created a Foreign Affairs Council, whose acronym is not very elegant, FAC, and draws on the COPs, which is the equivalent of the COREPERs, and geographical working groups for the making of all policies. So, and this is something that we will certainly know, in addition to this, we have the establishment of the EES, the European External Action Service, that was also tentatively and for a very short time named Foreign Ministry of the European Union during the convention, and then these terms surfaced and then faded away because of its controversial nature very soon, that is still sided at the Commission level for what we could call sectorial ministers, meaning, for instance, director generals, that this is the way they are called, directorate generals, this is the way they are called, that deal, for instance, with neighborhood and enlargement, rather than commercial policy, rather than development, for instance. So we do have, and at the moment, I just will say that actually we have a proliferation, paradoxically, of institutions. When this happens in general, and when there is controversy over the making of an institutional reform at the European level, this most often than not at the European level means that a given organization draws on pre-existing conflict and tough battles. So, what I will show you in a second is that clearly Lisbon has created and exacerbated existing conflict, institutional conflict that already existed within the European Union among both national and institutional actors. So we have a complication of the institutional script at all levels. This brings us to immediately pointing out what we could call a leadership paradox. No one would deny, not even the staunchest intergovernmental supporter would deny, that the European Union needs a strong steerswoman in charge of exerting direction and coherence to the European Union external action. And yet, and as usual, the devil is in the detail. So clearly we have different idea on how this telephone number or this leadership should be provided at the European level. So Agenstam and Johansson, for instance, mentioned the presence of two important caveats that define the margin of maneuver of discussing leadership at the European level. The first one is ideological, so to say, and stemmed by the fact that there is a sort of refusal on concentrating power of any kind, into a single institution. The idea of diffusing, spreading powers across different institutions precisely respond to the rationale of creating a sort of check and balance institutional systems that avoid precisely the concentration of power into a single institution. On the other hand, and as we have already mentioned, clearly when it comes to leadership in foreign policy, there is a national reflex, what Hoffman called preserving the heart of the artichoke, no, the alcachofa. We can leaf by leaf portion and erode portion of sovereignty, but when we get close to el corazón de la alcachofa, so foreign policy, national identity, strategic ability to project one's own international image, well, there we have a national reflex that block it. So these two different conditions explain the possibility of exerting leadership both for the newly established High Representative Vice President and its own service or bureaucracy, the EEAS. There are clearly, these sort of reflexes were very much present when the EEAS was conceived of, so during the discussions during the Convention for the Future of Europe. So on the one hand, we have those, and I have in mind Solana off the top of the head, who thought that the EEAS and High Representative should have been specifically linked to the Council, so to have a stronger foreign policy spin-off, and those, like for example, the Commission itself, surprise, surprise, but also the European Parliament, that wanted and advocated for a sort of closer link of the service within the Commission. This agreement between the member states sort of brought about a sort of mixed arrangement, with the EEAS being exactly at the crossroad between the two institutions and being labeled not an institution but a service that is functionally autonomous, independent from the two institutions, and it is hybrid in nature when it comes to its policymaker capacity. We will go back to that, but clearly this is the sort of original scene that explains much of the problems and troubles that the EEAS still navigating in exerting its ability to act at the institutional level and therefore at the international level. Now I would like to very quickly introduce formally some of the powers of the High Representative Vice President and then of the EEAS, so that then we can sort of zoom in some more specific on how they operate in the new machineries to deal with external affairs. Well, as you know, the Amsterdam Treaty has established the figures of the High Representative, and from 1999 to 2009, Solana has covered egregiously, someone would say it was an incredible legacy, this role. He performed this role working hand in gloves with the commissioners dealing for external affairs within the Commission, the head of the so-called RELEX family, that is, the families of DGs that deal, they were called like that, we don't call them like that anymore, that deal with external actions. So for the first 4 or 5 years, these commissioners was Chris Pattern and then Benita Ferrero-Waldner. So there you had two different roles in charge, respectively, to deal with foreign policy and with external action within the Commission. Well, Lisbon merges these two roles, and so we have a very inelegant way of title for the new post holder, the one of High Representative / Vice President of the European Union's foreign policy. This lack of elegance is clearly translated in a very awkward and hard to handle mandate, because the new High Representative / Vice President is in charge of chairing the newly established Foreign Affairs Council, being one of the executive vice president of the Commission in charge of coordinating the external actions of the European Union. He's head of the European External Action Service that is just established, so imagine the level of complexity of this position, and finally also head of the delegations and responsible for what we called the European Union Special Representative in Special Areas of Conflict. So you can imagine what this means, what sort of bureaucratic institutional quagmire the system established. So some commentators actually called it institutional schizophrenia, because on the same time, the High Representative Vice President is supposed to liaise with the Council and mediate and find solutions among the member states. liaise with an incredibly powerful established institution like the European Commission, and represent the European Union in the world, so traveling. No wonder that so far, more or less willingly, the post holders, these being Catherine Ashton, Federica Mogherini, and now Joseph Borrell, sort of decided and interpreted the role by somehow neglecting one of these legs. We may want to discuss this during the Q&A, but clearly, by design, it's a very, very difficult role. Ingrato, we would say in Italian. So you need to basically deal and try to make the entire machinery work without, as I will say in a second, a very clear mandate. And this is what the External Action Service, how am I doing time-wise? I must say I'm not controlling. Oh, fantastic. This brings us to define the role of the bureaucracy that sustain the efforts and ambitions of the High Representative / Vice President. So, as I will argue and as we may comment, the letter of the treaty is particularly ambiguous when it comes to defining the role of the European Union External Action Service. It supports the High Representative in fulfilling her mandate to conduct common foreign security policy and ensures consistency of the European Union external action, support the High Representative in her capacity as President of the Foreign Affairs Council, support the High Representative in the capacity of Vice President of the Commission, blah, 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 blah. Do you understand what it means? It supports, what is its portfolio? Where is its budget? Where is really responsible for something that is done? That's a little bit of the problem when it comes to the EAS. Clearly because, and specifically because of disagreement among the member states on the mission and rationale of the service, we have one of the most ambitious foreign policy institutions ever created that still navigate in uncertainties when it comes to define its own role. We will discuss that more into detail, and I will give you a snapshot of what it means exactly in a second, but clearly the European External Action Service, a very young institutional creature, needs to sort of carve out its roles without prejudice of the responsibilities of other institutions. So this leaves an incredible little margin for the European Union External Action Service to really project and assert its role. So as of late, the new Secretary General of the European External Action Service, appointed by Borrell, Stefano Sannino, an Italian that had a long-standing career within the European Commission, mentioned that the role of the service is the one of being a service at the service of all institutions. Once again, what does it mean in practice? No service, let alone a foreign service, can work without being endowed with a precise mission. We talk about esprit de corps. We talk about the missions to serve the Union. The mission to serve, it's really ambiguous and in practice very difficult to perform. Above all, when you are surrounded by players that try to keep their competence very close to their chest. So, not only this extremely vague mission, but as you know, we may want to discuss that. I'm going just to mention that in passing, also a new composition of the service. It's a service that for the first time is created by members of both the Commissions and the Council, of the Secretariat of the Council, and systematically by members of the diplomatic services of the member states. So there you can imagine that there is a struggle to find what theoretical discussions call an esprit de corps, meaning a single way of doing things. A commission official is a bureaucrat, with at heart the interest of the European Union, right? But it's a bureaucrat. He has a strong technical expertise, a perfect knowledge of the jargon and ways in which the houses, as they call it, work, but not so much an expertise in foreign policy. On the other hand, you have basically the diplomats of the member states, who are foreign policy experts and generalists. And I can tell you, most often than not, they are very, very easily bored by institutional intricacies and soap operas. And we will see that there are a lot of interesting bureaucratic soap operas when we talk about European Union foreign policy. So they are a little bit nervous when things start to get lengthy and difficult to push through. Finally, we have the negotiating soul of the EU's institutions. That is, the former members of the Secretary of the Council. So, three different souls, three different conceptions of what it means to be a quasi-foreign ministry, no. A service at the service of all institutions. Once again, a very, very complicated scripts. And there we go. Messy, isn't it? When we see it's difficult, it's messy, now all boils down to this. So, when it comes to do foreign policy, we can go back to the other method of cooperation, the community method, in a second. You can see here that the Lisbon Treaty has complicated at all stages of the policy cycle the script of making foreign policy. When it comes to the level of political initiatives, clearly Lisbon adds yet another player that has the power, not exclusive, of course, to propose political initiatives. So you have a renewed and reinforced European Council. You have the rotating president, the presidency of the European Union. You have the commissions, and now you have also the European, the High Representative Vice President of the Commission. So yet another players that can suggest, so going back to the question of leadership, what the EU should do in case to act at the international level. At the level of decisions, and we will go in some nitty-gritty of decision-making bureaucracy, the Lisbon Treaty complicated the tasks of making policy for the European Union because, as I mentioned, it separated the General Affairs Council from the Foreign Affairs Council. This means, and this in the face and with the insistence of having a comprehensive approach to foreign policy, that certain discussions, most notably those that relate to external actions, development, trade, so forth and so on, happens in what we call horizontal working group of the Council, while foreign policy decisions are discussed under the umbrella of the Foreign Affairs Council. So, you name an international problem, whatever it is today. How do we impose sanctions on Belarus, for instance? Well, you will have the same discussions happening in two different council configurations, which means 27 member states, two different chairs, one coming from the rotating the presidency of the European Union, the other from the European External Action Service, discussing in parallel on the making of the same decisions. So, as you can imagine, all boils down to formal, but above all informal, willingness to cooperate. Because if I want to hold information at my chest, I will most certainly do. This is notably the case when it comes to trade policy. As I mentioned before, common commercial policy can be really seen like the alma pulsante dell'azione esterna dell'Unione Europea. Is the most noble, the most ancient. And clearly, what did Commission's officials working in the field of trade, which is not completely, but certainly communitarized thought. You want to see that if we need to collaborate with the European External Action Service, decisions that are now taken, a qualifying majority voting, can be moved in the other council configuration and therefore be decided under unanimity rules, we don't say a word to our colleague of the European External Action Service. And it is a case which is perhaps the most famous. But as you can see, now we have an extremely difficulty of discussing how policies are made at the European Union without opening the Pandora boxes of empirical analysis. We cannot generalize at any stage on how the system works. Yeah? So clearly, this also is the case in the case of formulations of policies. All boils down, above all, as I said before, consider the strong emphasis on the comprehensive approach on personal relationship between national diplomats, the desk officers within the European External Action Service and the European Commission. If relations are good, we will have actually a living proof of what it means in practice, this very famous comprehensive approach that the European Union wants to pursue. If there are bad relations, you will see that there is a cacophony of different overlapping policies that makes more or less sense. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because I will tell you more about implementations in a second. But as you can imagine, in the light of this glorious mess, we can, as analysts and future analysts, go and look back to foreign policy analysis, bureaucratic policies, more and more to make sense of the European Union's foreign policy, right? After all, the more we get close to policies, the more we get close to people, the people that do stuff concretely, and the more we get close to soap opera in a European sauce. So there, clearly, it's where the mess, all the messy overtones are actually and surface. So capability expectations gap means also not only finding common commitments among all players, but also trying to navigate this institutional forest. Did I jump a slide? So, very quickly on this, the new system, it's more compartmentalized. So yes, comprehensive approach, yes, the ability of having creative and ambitious policies to be created, but more and more walls, bureaucratic walls, separating people, right? So the system only works if it is sustained by strong willingness to cooperate, yeah? If the European Union wants to have any sort of outcome done, well, we can only wish that there is a good relations percolating down from the level of the highest level of the Foreign Affairs Council down to the last desk officers working in the commissions or in the IES. Clearly, as I mentioned before, this also means that we have a foreign policy that is multiple in practice, in the sense that we cannot generalize as far as the ability of the European Union to make policies across policy areas, because it will depend actually on the ability of all actors to cooperate. And finally, and more importantly, once again, in the light of the comprehensive approach, and even more on the geopolitical ambitions of the new European institutions, we always need to take into account the fact that most policy competences are still held at the European Commission's level. Not only that, but as I will mention in a second, the money box, the ability to do stuff, what we today call the foreign policy instruments, which is functionally at the service of the European External Action Services, but strongly within the European Commission. So, not just for the EAS an unclear policy mandate, as Pierre Vimont has very egregiously state, we only have an administrative charter that tells us what the service is about. Certainly not a political mission. Not yet. Yeah? That has no money box. that needs to ask to the big sister European Commissions in order to make its policy viable. So far, so good? Yes, so let me move farther. I'm not going to get any farther into this mess. Yeah, I'm going to wrap up very, very clearly. But this explains you, and I'm here and keen to reply to any questions about it, the sort of institutional conundrum that the European external actions needs to navigate when it comes to exerting any forms of leadership, right? I mentioned that before. We are in a situation, we are in the Commission's versus EAS slides, yes? We are in a situation whereby actually policies to be made are trapped and kidnapped by the existence of strong interinstitutional turf battles between the External Action Service and the European Commission. Still a situation in which, as I mentioned before, the EAS has functionally the possibility of drawing on a budget that is still managed by the European Commission. So it's really, as it happened, informality, it's the bread and butter of European Union's foreign policy, not least because it reflects the limits of its own members, of the members, the national governments in the European Union. But the EAS, during the first days, not dissimilarly from what was the member of the European Union's, the delegations of the European Commissions around the world, have performed and were forced to perform the work of gladiators. You work without a mandate. You work with the inability of finding your own role. You need to constantly assert your visions vis-à-vis of institutions and national government that are jealous of their own prerogative. So not easy, not an easy situation, and a situation that thus far, mostly draws on the ability of all the actors in town to be willing to cooperate, right? Step by step, and I'm going to move forward, some sort of decisions have and are progressively easing these very difficult tasks. So, for instance, as of 2019, we have weekly meetings among the heads of cabinets, all the commissions and the EAS dealing with external affairs. So the ESCO that brings together on a weekly basis, all the members of the cabinets to make policies and to make sure that the comprehensive approach is actually in place. And then you have the EBDO at the level of the head of the cabinets. So step by step, they are trying to find ways to make sense of this situation. But yes, yet some observers, including myself, would argue too little too late. You do not create an institutions that need to go through hell instead of thinking precisely what they need to do. Interinstitutional arrangements needs to be created before, need to precede the birth of a new institutions, cannot follow them. Because clearly you create precedents of acrimonies. I know it sounds like psychology, but this is it when you work with people. You need to make people comfortable and willing to cooperate, and that certainly was not the case with the establishment of the service. All these considerations notwithstanding, and I wrap up here, I would argue that the European External Action Service managed to carve out a little bit of a role in the making of foreign policy. As yesterday Pilar was mentioning, certainly this is most notably the case in the field of strategic planning. Public diplomacy can be improved but still is there, and external communication. If you notice, this is all or almost all stuff that do not require, once again, a money box. So strategic collaboration is potentially long-term very important because, as also Borrell has underscored, it is perhaps one way of moving towards a definition of a common strategic culture. Clearly, it's a chimera, but something that brings the member states analysts closer when it comes to strategic foresight. Public diplomacy and the current failure, the sort of debacle in Ankara with Michel and van der Leyen, but also Borrell in Moscow underscore, it's important to find, yet and again, I think Borrell has it very clear, to find and push forward a narrative of what the European Union stands for. And finally, disinformation. We can discuss, there were allegations in 2015 of the European External Action Service having watered down a report on Chinese disinformation. And yet there we are looking at extremely interesting, creative and innovative ways of answering and tackling, basically virtually with no money, a global problem that's so pressing. So, yet and again, that is great. The only risk that I see, because as you can see, I'm talking about functions that could be performed by a think tank. The only risk that I see, although everything is great, is that the European External Action Service sort of evolves as a very advanced European Union think tank or a sort of service completely at the service of the post holder of the High Representative. This could be great because clearly the expertise, always technical expertise found in the commissions, is vital to the making of foreign policy. But I would argue that the EAS is the only actor in town that can see the forest of the EU external action policy and not just the trees, right? So the idea and the risk to minimize is exactly to have a basically powerless think tank that perform important functions. Muchas gracias para la atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Caterina, por esta presentación tan interesante, tan bien articulada, tan enérgica también, y yo diría, por lo que a mí respecta, tan convincente. Desafortunadamente no tenemos mucho tiempo,
Lo siento.
y porque además el señor Alexander Yanis no está preparado casi ya para intervenir. Pero bueno, me permito hacer un comentario, y es que dado que nos reúne precisamente la voluntad de elaborar un documento con algunas propuestas concretas, pues yo creo que tu presentación tiene una implicación muy clara, ¿no?, en una propuesta concreta que quizás no exija necesariamente la reforma de los tratados, pero sí parecería, ¿no?, que exige una reorganización interna de estas relaciones interinstitucionales a las que les otorgas una gran importancia. Podemos conceder 2-3 minutos, porque el señor Alexander Yanis está pendiente, y por favor, si hay alguna intervención, brevemente, porque tenemos que pasar enseguida a la siguiente. Allí parece que hay una. Aquí, perdón, primero. Por favor, muy breves.
Muchísimas gracias por su muy sugerente presentación, que creo que nos ha planteado preguntas a todos. Para mí hay una cuestión fundamental. Cuando se creó el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior se pensaba, siguiendo lo que los diplomáticos esperaban, que el órgano seguiría la función, y eso finalmente no ocurrió. Entonces, quería plantearle lo que a mí me ha sugerido su presentación. Después del Tratado de Lisboa surge un problema importante. Cuando se le asigna el monopolio de la representación a la Comisión, el Consejo rechaza la idea de que el uso del monopolio de la representación pueda derivar en lo que sería igualmente la formulación o la delimitación de la extensión de la competencia. Eso desde ese momento ha sido el gran tema de conflicto, si representar significa definir el contenido de la competencia. Entonces, el conflicto entre la Comisión y el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior responde igualmente a que el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior está más vinculado al Consejo de Ministros. Muchas gracias.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por su ponencia. Yo soy Álvaro Mellán López, graduado en Relaciones Internacionales por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Y yo quería preguntar sobre cuál fue la implicación de España en el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior. Es decir, ¿qué aportaciones técnicas aportó España a la creación del organismo y hasta qué punto fue importante la presidencia española del Consejo de la Unión Europea en el primer semestre de 2010 para el devenir del Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior? Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Yo creo que el problema está donde está la madre de todos los problemas en la Unión Europea, que es el reparto de competencias. En el reparto de competencias, porque el alto representante lo que debería hacer en puridad es un ministro de Asuntos Exteriores, y los ministros de Asuntos Exteriores están en los gobiernos. No están ni en la jefatura de Estado ni en el Senado, que es lo que debería hacer el Consejo. Tendríamos que hacer una reubicación institucional total que efectivamente permitiría al ministro de Asuntos Exteriores de la Unión Europea, como se llamaba en la Constitución Europea, que esto funcionara correctamente. Pero claro, entonces solamente se podría ocupar de las cuestiones que son competencias de la Unión, no de las cuestiones que siguen siendo competencias de los Estados, en las que se deja, bueno, que asome un poco la patita el alto representante, pero no más. Y claro, si queremos jugar en una división en la que no estamos, pues tenemos esos problemas. Pero me parece muy sugerente las propuestas para cambiar esas inercias. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos, a todas por las preguntas. Intentaré de responder en español. Empiezo con la última y claro, por supuesto, lo que necesitamos es una verdadera operación de creatividad institucional, de ingeniería institucional, por repensar los márgenes de maniobra que la Unión Europea tenga en términos prácticos, a pesar de los vínculos. Yo allá soy pragmatista, soy realista. No podemos imaginar que la Unión Europea o que alguna reforma pueda adelantar si no está el acuerdo de los Estados miembros. Entonces están de los límites reales. Lo que podemos pensar es cómo abatir los muros entre las instituciones y crear trabajo que tiene más sentido. La burocracia es la cara de la política. Nosotros hablamos de política y muchas veces es precisamente algo que no pasa a nivel solo de decisión política, más de formulación política, ¿sí? De implementación. Allá está mucho que podría ser menos controvertido y más fácil a adelantar. Dejo aquí por límite de tiempo. Claro, benchmark being that it will remain an intergovernmental field of cooperation. Sí, sur tu pregunta, claro, la Unión ahora tiene personalidad jurídica internacional después Lisbona. Esto ha provocado, claro, que también la representación exterior fuera sube la dirección del alto representante / vicepresidente de la Comisión. Claro, una vez más, es un discurso súper interesante por los que son apasionados de política burocrática, por lo menos como a mí. Puede ser que vosotros no lo sabéis, pero sí, aún allá también, cuando se habla de delegaciones de representación exteriores, tenemos muros, pared, que separan la competencia. Un sistema de mandados para la delegación que depende a la vez al High Representative y a la vez a la Comisión. Entonces está mucho que hacer cuando se habla de cómo hacerlo, cómo adelantarlo. Por supuesto, si uno mira al aspecto de la diplomacia, de la representación diplomática, ves que el sistema es plural de representación. Depende de la sede multilateral, depende de la competencia, una vez más, vamos a ver una distinta cara que te explica y que te representa la Unión. Entonces, no es más sencillo de cómo lo fue adelante. Tu pregunta, yo no soy especialista en esta cuestión, pero claro que están diplomáticos españoles, funcionarios españoles en este momento, y desde el empezó de la experiencia, que han determinado la forma de cierta estructura de colaboración. Pensa a Serrano. Serrano ha completamente reformado desde Ashton a Mogherini toda la estructura de crisis management. Es allá un muy poderoso diplomático capaz de también determinar la estructura. Nel secretariato de la comisión ahora están muchos españoles, que no voy a hacer nombre, que pero aún están intentando de encontrar forma de mejorar la coordinación entre las dos instituciones. Entonces el imprinting español yo diría que es muy fuerte. Claro, España tiene reputación para ser europeísta, entonces su posición fuera siempre la más adelantada cuando se habla de política exterior. Esto es en gran medida reflectido en la contribución española a la making of the European External Action Service.
Muchísimas gracias, Caterina. Tenemos ya la sesión y sin cuestión de continuidad, inmediatamente vamos a ceder la palabra a la sesión de clausura con el señor Alexander Yanis.